October 25th, 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The air was close and stifling, but it was the silence that struck deepest, a silence pregnant with menace. All around me, Marines dug into shallow scrapes and listened to the distant rumble in the jungle. We'd held this embattled strip of dirt for nearly 3 months, and that night we knew something was moving in the darkness. General Masao Maruyama's 2nd Division was gathering its strength, thousands of men pressing through the mud and roots for one last suicidal charge. In our weapons platoon, the mortar crews fussed over their tubes, lean 60mm barrels that gleamed faintly under the cover of ponchos. Fingers brushed the cold steel as though it were a rosary bead before battle. Little did we know, these squat French-born weapons would face 3,000 screaming Japanese soldiers in the biggest Banzai charge of the Pacific. That night, Henderson Field would become a proving ground for Edgar Brandt's design. Edgar Brandt's origins. But memory bid me to begin long before Guadalcanal. Back in Paris, at the workbench of a French ironworker named Edgar William Brandt. He was born on Christmas Eve, 1880. An artisan who trained his hands in silver, jewelry, fine designs of leaf and vine. To him, iron was no crude material. It could be persuaded, coaxed, shaped into artistry. Yet when the cannons roared in 1914 and sons of France fell in mud-slicked trenches, this craftsman turned his eye toward survival. From his forge came not filigree, but a new shape of shell, slender, grooved, and wondrously aerodynamic. Brandt had watched his brothers-in-arms wrestle with heavy, awkward weapons, unable to strike where they truly needed. He solved it with a mortar round so ingenious that when he patented it in 1925, the heart of the design would live on virtually unchanged for almost a century. His creations of 60mm, 81mm, and 120mm mortars echoed across armies of the world. But it would be the sprightly 60mm machine that would capture America's imagination. America identified a gap. By the waning 1920s, our own army discovered it was armed like a prizefighter missing a left hook. Grenades reached maybe 75 yards, the distance of a desperate sprint. The heavy 81mm mortar roared 3,000 yards afar. Fine for distant hills, not so fine when the enemy massed close. Between those extremes stretched a void lethal and tempting to any daring foe. Field commanders needed a weapon that could slot neatly in between, a device nimble enough to hollow a rifle company on its march, yet vicious enough to yawn open at an enemy line like a thunderclap. In 1938, the War Department got its hands on 8 French Brandt mortars. They called the trial version the M1. But when our engineers at WWII, that old fortress of American gun-making, standing since the War of 1812, studied the design, they saw not just steel, but potential. They took Brandt's elegant lines and threaded them with American standards, redrawing tubes, plates, fittings. Out from their shop rolled the M2, a mortar tuned to American hands, ready to sing in every company's chorus. Factories joined the cause. WWII had forged thunder since 1889, but the little M2 carried a new spirit. This was artillery brought down into the hands of the infantryman, an equalizer resting on a soldier's back. In January of 1940, the Army placed its first order for 1,500 mortars, a whisper of what history would demand. Then war flooded Europe, and production roared awake in the Pennsylvania plants. Reed Machinery in York ran hot, Kennedy Van Son in Danville joined, even Firestone Tire Rubber put down their wheels and built weapons. The machines never slept. By war's end, over 60,000 M2s rolled into crates, every one destined for the hard hands of soldiers and Marines. Design genius. What made the M2 beloved by its crews was this: simplicity married to brilliance. 42 pounds whole, it could split neatly into 3 packs for carrying. Fixed in its belly sat the secret: Brandt's firing pin welded in place. Drop a shell, and instantly it barked. There was no delay, no complex trigger to confuse in the panic of night assault. A good crew could breathe out an unbroken rhythm, 18 rounds sustained per minute. But when eyes grew wide and fate crouched close in the form of a screaming charge, Those same squads could hurl 100 shells aloft every minute, 15 or 20 hanging in the heavens before the first touchdown to Earth. Such was ingenuity, reshaped into firepower. A weapon is nothing without the teeth it bears, and the M2 had 3 very different bites. The M49A2 high-explosive round, 3 pounds of steel and intent, burst with a killing radius of 17 yards, enough to shred platoons if they huddled unwisely. Then there was the M83 Illuminator. She was heavier, 3.5 pounds, but when she bloomed in the sky, she burned with 11,000 candles of hissing white glory, dangling from a parachute for 25 seconds. No soldier who witnessed a jungle suddenly floodlit at midnight ever forgets it. It was like someone tearing away the curtains of darkness. The most fearsome, late to the war but unforgettable, was the M302 white phosphorus shell. She cloaked men in burning smoke and terror, a devil's invention that suffocated and set alight whatever she kissed. Inside each shell lay its hidden spark, the M5A1 ignition cartridge, a mere 20-gauge charge of ballistite powder. Drop it down, crack, and the world shifted, sending that round nearly 1,815 meters ahead. The men behind the mortar. The mortar was only half the story. The other half was the living machine, the squad. At first, 16 men shaped the mortar section, nestled inside the weapons platoon. A sharp-eyed sergeant commanded, beneath him 3 mortar squads led by hardened corporals. Each had his role as precise as clockwork. The corporal carried the M4 sight when moving, like a jeweler protecting his loop. The gunner bore the whole mortar tube itself, balanced on aching shoulders. An assistant clutched the aiming stakes, ensuring math met muscle. And 3 ammunition bearers trudged forward with their vests laden in steel cylinders. Those vests bulged like a grocer's bag at market day, though each shell weighed heavily on the man beneath. By May 1944, the Corps did away with the weapons platoon entirely, swelling the mortar section into 20 men under company headquarters itself. The wisdom had been learned in blood, fire support at the commander's fingertips, unshackled by layers of delay. They called it hip pocket artillery, and every Marine company commander cherished it, a thunderbolt he needn't beg higher echelons for. Prelude to the night. By the time General Maruyama's columns crept close to Henderson Field, we had already baptized the M2 in skirmishes. A shell lobbed here, 3 craters blooming there. It taught us that with a few whispered calculations, we could write death on the map before the enemy even appeared. So when orders crackled through on October 25th and scouts whispered of thousands pressing in the blackness, our mortars were already zeroed in, pre-registered upon trails, ravines, and gullies we knew the Japanese would use. We listened in silence that night as the Tokyo Express again lashed the field with shells from the sea, chaos reigning, but Henderson refusing to break. When the guns fell silent, we knew the next act was ours. The charge begins. At precisely 0445, the forest screamed. 3,000 men of Maruyama's 16th and 29th regiments spilled forward, rifles blazing from their hips, voices unified in that terrifying cry, Banzai. They had broken the Chinese in the past, swept the British aside in Malaya, but never before had they met the cold, precise mathematics of American firepower waiting in the dark. Our first answer was light. The M83 rounds coughed skyward and parachutes blossomed overhead. Suddenly the curtain tore away, and we saw them. Wave after wave of men surging against the wire, arms outstretched like shadows lit ghastly white against their jungle backdrop. Targets, impossibly clear. That is when the thunder began. Mortar fury. The tubes barked like beasts unleashed. Where a man had stood, only geysers of dirt and flesh remained. The mortars roared so furiously their voices fused into one constant thunder, an unending clap that rolled over jungle and sea alike. We fired so quickly that the sky itself seemed crowded with shells fumbling through their arcs, 100 rounds each from spread-out crews, a rain of iron that turned men into shadows and shadows into nothing at all. Those who staggered through flame and barbed wire found no solace, for where the mortars left off, The machine guns finished. Forward observers, eyes grim and cold, adjusted fire. Left 50, add 100. Every attempt to bunch together was punished with fire. Every flank was stripped bare with light. Where artillery could not curve high enough, mortars fell in like hawks into ravines. The dawn aftermath. By first light, the earth stank of cordite, blood, and wet jungle mold. More than 1,500 Japanese soldiers lay still across the approaches to Henderson Field, their cries silenced, their regiments broken for good. Our lines had bent, but never buckled. Roughly 60 of our brothers paid the ultimate price, but buy for buy, the M2 mortars had exacted a dreadful and decisive toll. Courage met calculation that night, and calculation held the field.
War has a way of forcing men into corners, and sometimes those corners birth legends. On Okinawa, April 13, 1945, Technical Sergeant Buford Anderson of the 381st Infantry, 96th Division, faced just such a moment. A counterstroke hit his unit's flank at dawn, Japanese forces driving hard. He shoved his squad into the safety of an ancient tomb, an Okinawan stone grave, and stood outside alone to hold back hell. With only a carbine in hand, Anderson spat lead until the last cartridge clicked empty. Then, eyeing the ground, he snatched up a Japanese mortar shell that had failed to detonate. With raw instinct, he flung it back. By miracle, it exploded, shredding attackers. His eyes then fell upon a box of American M2 mortar rounds. He pulled safety pins, hammered the bases against rock to arm them, and, one after another, hurled those live shells forward like hand grenades. They leapt into fireballs among the enemy, killing 25, destroying machine guns, breaking knee mortar teams. By the end, Anderson stood winded but alive. The hills still held. He would later accept the Medal of Honor from President Truman, but I doubt in that instant he thought of medals at all, only survival. What Anderson revealed with sweat and grit was something unintentional yet priceless in Brandt's design. The 60mm shells were light enough that a strong man could hurl them by hand in extremity. Their fixed-pin ignition meant they could detonate even without the tube if struck hard on the base. The mortar was so simple, so reliable, that even stripped of half its parts, it could still kill. A craftsman in Paris had carved a machine of clean lines, and an American sergeant on Okinawa had twisted it into the bluntest of knives. And it worked. Eugene Sledge and the Ridge. But ingenious sergeants weren't the only ones testing the boundaries of the weapon. Marine Eugene Sledge, scholar turned warrior, remembered his mortar as more than firepower. It was a problem solver. On Okinawa, his squad faced a stubborn ridge, one that artillery had pounded for days with no effect. The ridge's secret was a slender gully cresting its crown, shielded from the flat arcs of larger guns. The Japanese nestled there like hornets, safe from heavy shelling. Sledge's sergeant, a veteran named Bergen, thought differently. He set 3 mortars, each angled to overlap like scissors across that gully. One fired across from left, another from right, and a third drove straight down the ridgeline. When the overlapping shots whistled in, nowhere remained for the enemy to cling. 50 men carpeted that gully by the end. 50 silent Japanese who thought the ridge unassailable. The infantry climbed unopposed, thanks to mortars the artillery had underestimated. Ingenious angles. What Sledge showed that day was something all commanders learned to prize: the angle. Artillery fires flat, but mortars bend high, reaching places no shell otherwise could. Where bunkers hid on reverse slopes, where gullies snaked out of sight, where courage nestled in shadows, the M2 could reach. To the company commander, it was the ace in pocket, the howitzer he could carry in his hip. Brandt's design had saved Anderson's flank and unlocked Bergen's ridge, and that was just the beginning. The enemy takes note. The Japanese too were watching, recording, weighing. Captured papers showed they studied our mortar fire with dread fascination. They sneered that our troops depended too heavily on bombardment, but in the same breath admitted that our mortars laced fire so steadily, so persistently, that counterattacks bled white before reaching us. They learned to crawl underground when barrages started. Caves, tunnels, cellars. But their doctrine still salted away faith in the sort of infantry spirit. The sudden charge, the silent infiltration. And therein lay their misfortune. For courage, once unmatched, dashed itself to pieces against mathematics and mortars. Maruyama's dead on Guadalcanal bore witness. Okinawa's ridges whispered it again. Against fire plotted with slide rules and maps, raw bravery had met its natural enemy. The knee mortar and its failure. They weren't without their own tubes. The Type 89 50mm grenade discharger, christened the knee mortar by Americans, though Lord help the fool who actually fired it from his knee. 12 of them might be found in a single Japanese company, far outnumbering our trio of M2s. But range was a cruel limitation. Barely 75 yards could those stubby barrels carry. Against our 1,800-yard reach, theirs were loaded daggers flung into gunfire. Crews had to crawl unnervingly close, often right under the jaws of rifles and machine guns, just to scratch at us. Too many never came back. Meanwhile, our mortar crews sat further behind the line, tossing shells over the heads of brothers and into the teeth of the enemy. The knee mortars were, though plentiful, were dwarfed, forced always to reach too far.
By 1945, you could hear it in the factories of America, as surely as in the foxholes of the Pacific. A pulse, hammering through steel and sweat. In the first 8 months alone of that year, more than 30,000 mortars thundered off production lines, nearly matching the total of the 3 years prior. Reed machinery cut steel in York. Kennedy Van Son's engineers sweated in Danville. Firestone's workers set aside tires and turned out death from their lines. Waterville Arsenal, mother of them all, kept refining the process at a war pitch. At its peak, 9,000 men and women labored there, assembling not just mortars but cannons for every front. Between 1940 and 1945, Waterville put out nearly 50,000 guns at a staggering $260 million cost. Where once these shops rang only with tools, now they echoed with the tempo of frenzy. America's industrial breath drawn deep and exhaled as battlefield thunder. A soldier's pocket artillery. The M2 was more than numbers. Its genius was in the smallness of its reach, that a company commander bent over in the mud could call instantly, shaping skies full of steel in moments. No telegram to higher headquarters, no ponderous wait for division artillery. He needed fire, and he had it. That flexibility, wed to American production, meant that each rifle company on a Pacific rock carried the means to warp the field around them. The Japanese, bound by rigidity and central orders, often found that by the time their mortars or artillery spoke, we had already finished our moves. Their courage was never in doubt. But courage delayed was courage wasted. The M2 whispered to our commanders that they owned fire when they needed it, and by God, that changed wars. The black sands of Iwo Jima. And then came the small volcanic island that seared itself into every man's mind, Iwo Jima. Barely 8 square miles of rock, dug into with 18 kilometers of tunnels, bristling with machine guns and artillery, sighted to rake every yard. General Kuribayashi commanded 21,000 defenders, hardened, resolute. Square by square, they had recorded their fields of fire, marrying human grit to volcanic stone. Intelligence whispered 75% casualties awaited us. There was no mystery. To take Iwo, we would have to bleed. 70,000 Marines descended upon those black sands, and with them marched the squat weight of M2 mortars. Larger guns roared from ships and batteries, but too often their fire skimmed too shallow, too flat, splashing against walls of stone while the enemy crouched unseen beneath. Here, the mortar found its true stage. Shells bent high into the sky, dropped down upon cave mouths, down ravines, down reverse slopes where other fire could not reach. The 60mm, as so often before, proved itself indispensable. Trapped chambers and diving tunnels shook with its gifts of steel. Victory and cost. For 36 hellish days we fought yard by yard. When it ended, 24,000 American casualties scarred the rolls, 6,000 of them dead,
brothers forever left beneath the island's sand. Nearly all of Kuribayashi's garrison fell with them, a fortress extinguished. And amid that cost, the M2 had proven its worth again. Small, quick-handed, efficient. It dropped rounds where needed most, into shadows artillery could not shame. Kuribayashi was a commander unlike any other. And still, in the end, even his cunning positions could not resist death falling vertically from above. Edgar Brandt's design, once crafted in an artisan's workshop, had triumphantly met perhaps the harshest battlefield test the Pacific dared offer. Strategic ripples. What lay hidden in all this was something bigger even than battlefield victory. America had learned the lesson of fire flexibility, and industry had turned learning into abundance. Every rifle company had its thunder in pocket. The Japanese relied on brittle, centralized support, bound by tradition, orders, and delay. Against a network of mortars firing almost at will, that doctrine came undone. For every company commander with a map and sight, victory could be reached swiftly and in step with his maneuver. That doctrine, as much as any bullet fired, would carry us closer to Japan's doorstep.
The final push to victory. As the war surged ever closer to Japan's doorstep, the mortar's voice never faltered. On Saipan, on Okinawa, in every bitter contested ridge and ravine, the M2 was there, haunting the shadows, answering swiftly to shouted coordinates, bending arcs of fire into places even battleships could not touch. By the time we closed upon Okinawa, the Japanese threw everything they had: kamikazes in the skies, reinforced bunkers on the hills, armies clinging to belief in the old ways. Yet again the mortars, snub, brutal, and immediate, helped unpick the seams. Each pocket artillery waited only on the word of a lieutenant, not the clearance of generals. And that independence spelled doom for defenses resting on rigidity. The bleeding edge of firepower. The Japanese military studied us to the very end, filling captured papers with grudging diagrams. They admitted our armies were susceptible to artillery and bombing, but they also called our mortars relentless, capable of choking off any counterattack before it could breathe. They, who cherished courage and surprise, now found such faith dashed against a wall of iron math. When courage rushed forward, mortars answered overhead. When formations gathered in dark jungle clearings, the sky simply rained. It was not that our men were braver, for they were human, as frightened and exhausted as any, but they held thunder in their very pockets. Such was the difference Brandt's barrel had made. Production and overmatch. By the war's close, the numbers alone were staggering. Industrial dynamism, factories in Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, had conjured more than 60,000 mortars and endless crates of shells. Firestone, Reed Machinery, Kennedy Van Sown, ordinary American firms that once made tires or machines, now pushing death into crates and boxcars, day and night. We did not merely match the enemy, we smothered him under quantity and quality alike. Every American rifle company marched forward with fire support built into its bones. The Japanese soldier often walked knowing his support sat far behind, or not at all. In that mismatch lay the outcome of countless fights. It was Karl Marx's nightmare, Henry Ford's dream, mass production unshackled from delay, turning tactics on their head. Beyond 1945. When Japan fell silent on August 15, 1945, we laid our tubes aside at last. But the M2 did not retire then.
It watched dawn in Korea's hills, where Chinese human waves met shells plunging into frozen gullies. It whispered again in Vietnam's jungles, high-angled arcs threading through treetops. Not until the 1970s did the M24 take its place and send the old warrior home. Nearly 40 years of service, astonishing longevity for something conceived in a Parisian artisan's hand. The artisan's legacy. Edgar Brandt likely never knew how far his revolution would travel. From delicate silverwork to battlefield thunder, his mortar bestowed on every infantry company the artillery brain once guarded at the regiment or division. America refined it, mass-produced it, then used it to smash Banzai charges, bend fire into gullies, light up midnight jungles, and grind even the strongest fortresses into dust. It was not only a weapon, but a symbol, the distillation of industrial democracy into steel. A commander no longer needed to plead with higher headquarters. With his hip-pocket artillery, he bent fire like a craftsman shaping metal, the same craft Brandt himself once practiced. When I think back to that night on Guadalcanal, the jungle splitting open under a torrent of shells, the truth is clear. Courage is timeless, but courage without firepower is tragedy. We had steel and science in our hands, fixed firing pins, clean threads, the voice of factories working through the night, and the enemy did not. The M2 mortar was more than a tube of steel. It was the revolution of flexibility, the lightning extension of a commander's will, the triumphs of industrial ingenuity over doctrine frozen in centuries past. And so when the war ended, I looked at those small mortars with an odd reverence. They had been carried on our shoulders through mud and fire, fed from crates stamped in America's heartland, and fired against enemies whose bravery could not alter mathematics. They were our hip-pocket artillery, and they had helped us carry the field from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima and beyond. With every round dropped into their throats, the very rules of infantry war were rewritten forever. From Parisian forge to Pacific jungle, from Banzai charge to Medal of Honor, the tale of the M2 mortar is not only that of a weapon, but of a transformation. Where once infantry fought in locked symmetry, courage meeting courage, after Brandt's design and America's industry, battles were fought with mathematics and fire precision. The world saw courage undone not by lack of will, but by the scientific certainty of mortars in pockets. Thus ended not only a war, but an era when courage alone could decide a battle between infantrymen.